is obviously one of them. Okay. So what I'll do is I'm going to try and keep it as informal as possible. So if you do have questions, please don't hesitate to ask as we go through. Alternatively, at the end, as Simon said, just to give you a heads up on what we're going to be discussing today primarily, I'll give you a brief introduction to Australia, some of the numbers and why it's so important, and why looking at Australia is relevant from a trade point of view and from your business points of view, what we at Hall Chadwick have seen, and because we do quite a lot of business with various parts of the world, but in particular with the UK. We'll discuss briefly the new reality, and that new reality is not only the free trade agreement. We won't get down to the weeds of that because it's a 700-page document which still must go through various gatekeepers, but nonetheless it would be remiss of us not to at least mention it and discuss it in brief. There's also tax issues. There's the new G7 initiatives in global corporate taxation, which is all part of that new landscape. And then there are various operational aspects at a practical level when it comes down to doing business in Australia. And that even goes down to structural type issues on a sort of at a more direct level. So as Simon said, if someone does want to have questions or has any questions afterwards as well, or if they want to take something offline because it's more appropriate for them, we can either do it after this session or alternatively we'll make another time that works in with you. I spend a significant amount of my time after hours with folks in the UK or businesses in the UK doing just that. So please, it's part of the exercise of your relationship with HURST, and the ability of HURST to reach out to us and us to actually deal with them is all part of that facility that works very, very well for everybody. So without further ado, just broadly speaking, in terms of the Australian dynamic, Australia's got a population of just under 26 million. You guys have got a population of almost 68 million. So the question that quite often comes up is, like, Australia is so small, why should we bother? Why would we spend a lot of energy in such a small marketplace? And I understand the relevance of that, but Australia's got a presence in the world economy significantly greater than our demographic suggests. So the first thing is the economic opportunity which is there in Australia, and we'll come to that specifically. There's a broader context of the APAC regional relevance, because you've got the ability, or business has the ability, not only to come to Australia to interact, buy, sell and so forth, but it also is quite often used as a jump-off point for the broader APAC region. We're the biggest Western economy here. It's very easy to do business here, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on, but broadly speaking, that concept is understood. And I was speaking to a new client the other week. What they're doing is they're actually parking somebody in Australia, and that person is going to have responsibility for the APAC region, is going to be doing a lot of travel when circumstances and the times rotate to allow that type of travel. But it is a very, very strong jump-off point for the Asia-Pacific region. Okay? In Australia also, we've got a significant amount of people with Chinese backgrounds. So what we've also seen with other organisations where they do want to come to Australia, establish in the Australian marketplace, and also go into Asia, having that strong Asian presence makes it easier to actually recruit staff locally, so those staff can also then interact with the international, with the APAC region. And very interestingly, from APAC's importance, I know this is, I'll hark back to Australia in a moment, but by 2050, the stats or the work that's being done suggests that 2/3 of global production and consumption is going to take place in APAC. Okay. So that's a pretty large figure, and that has a huge business impact. So when your marketplace is going to be in region, it follows suit that many businesses will want to have a presence in region to exploit in the most positive of ways that marketplace. So if 2/3 of consumption is going to take place here, people are going to want to do things with their production facilities, with their sales, marketing initiatives and strategies. So once again, APAC is a really, really relevant jurisdiction, a relevant region for that, which broadly speaking, everyone is aware of its relevance, but those numbers very much suggest that the roadshow that people have to do to get on the bandwagon should happen sooner rather than later. And those that do will, in actual fact, benefit from it through the planning exercise. And just to give you a little bit of extra information, Australia, from the Australian point of view, Australia is the 12th largest economy in the world out of about 194 that the World Bank actually monitors. We rate it number 12. So given our relatively small size in demographic, but we make up for it in that regard. So once again, I don't work for the government. I'm not the marketing specialist for Australia, but there is a very, very strong imperative, and you will see some of the clients that we've, and I'll talk about those sort of things a little bit later on, that we've had very strong traction with the UK across a broad array of industries. The context in the first instance of the UK and Australia, what's our existing relationship? And most people are probably aware it's very warm. But in terms of a trading sense, Australia, the UK is Australia's 5th largest trading partner from a goods point of view. From a services point of view, it's a 3rd largest partner. And in terms of two-way trade, there's 870 odd billion worth of dollars at last count based on 2020. I haven't got the 2021 figures. So that strong trade relationship is obviously going to be ongoing, and more people are exploring it and exploiting it in the most positive senses as we go along. And the free trade agreement will, in actual fact, enhance that. Now, the exact amount it's going to elevate, I can't tell you, but there are a number of benefits of that free trade agreement that many people will be able to take advantage on. And we'll talk about that possibly a little bit later on as well. I don't know the size of all the businesses and all the delegates, all the participants around the room, but really in the SME sectors, I imagine many of you are in the M space, some of you might be in the S space, but definitely in the SME space. At the moment, there's probably at the moment, I think just looking at my numbers, there's something like 13 to 14,000 small to medium-sized businesses in the UK that are actually transacting with Australia. And not only are they transacting with Australia very successfully, that also generates a significant amount of employment in the UK, both from an export and an import point of view. So once again, the relationship is close, the economic impact is significant, and it's growing from that point of view. So once again, from looking at strategic development and strategically looking at new markets, Australia definitely does give that. With 0.3 of the world's population, but about 1.6% of the world's economy, which is what we are, that sort of speaks to the volumes that it, in all probability, does. So the question is, why Australia? What are the comparative strengths that we have? And we've already talked about some of them being the strong ties to Asia. Okay, there's growth sectors that we're enjoying. Not only the mining sector, there's very, very strong growth sectors. Despite COVID, we've had some very, very strong successes, like other jurisdictions, as I'm sure you have as well. And quite aside from COVID, we've also had that for a number of years, and we will talk about that as well. So let's talk about COVID for one moment, because it seems to be very much a focal point for many people. Australia, we took a drop in our economic output of about 2.5% under COVID, okay, which is obviously not the most desirable that we wanted to have happen. But when you compare that to you guys as an example, you had a 10% drop. So we actually fared quite well, both on forgetting the actual pandemic medical side of life, but that's part of the reason. From an economic point of view, things were not nearly as challenging as what they thought they were going to be initially. Okay. One of the other things about Australia, in terms of the why Australia and why you should be looking to Australia, is that strong tie to Asia, generally speaking. Now, quite often people, when I make that statement, they think, oh, you mean China? And that is not necessarily the case. We know that China's got a certain dynamic at the moment and it's causing certain challenges, and China is important. I'm not going to downplay the importance of China, but what the China exercise has actually done in the world today, it has actually made, as a consequence of COVID, it has made people reconsider their supply lines, their logistics, and the business attributes that go with it. I'm sure that in your jurisdiction, just like my jurisdiction, we had empty shelves on a number of different occasions. So what occurs is that people don't want to have to go through that again. So they are looking at their supply lines. They're looking to see where they should be seeking alternatives to the China dynamic. That doesn't mean necessarily leaving China totally. In some cases it will. And it's also very expensive to actually set up new production lines in other jurisdictions. But there is definitely an appetite as a consequence of what's happened in the world today with China, that is actually changing, and people are actively looking. And the places they're actively looking at, apart from other parts of the world, they're still looking within Asia. And the emerging economies in Asia, such as Vietnam, are a very, very key destination that people are looking at. The issue of emerging economies, if you would have gone back 20 years ago and said China was an emerging economy, and it's taken so long to get to where it is today, when an economy emerges today, it emerges at a considerably faster pace than what it did some 20 years ago. So the runway is going to be very condensed. So there's opportunity there to actually look at those marketplaces, look at those alternatives, to take advantage, if they are right, for the circumstances that you find yourself in. And that was obviously different for everybody concerned. And just on that particular point, I'm pretty certain that, let me just move for 1 second, guys. I think you thought I died and the lights went off. When it comes to those emerging economies, what actually happened, what I believe is also happening, I believe, Simon, if I'm not incorrect, or correct me if I'm mistaken, but I believe you've got a session planned for later on in the year on emerging economies and Vietnam specifically as well. Is that correct?
Correct, yeah. Later this year, probably autumn, winter time, yeah. Yeah,
so I mean, that's very much a relevant consideration from the Australian point of view, but from your point of view as well, in terms of if you are manufacturing, if you are producing, apart from the actual market itself, from a sales perspective, being able to actually consider that, because there are very, very strong considerations there. Okay, there are a number of people in the audience today that I've seen I've actually met when I was probably there in 2019, I think was the last time I was there, Simon. Yeah. So if you've heard some of these things, I apologise, put up with me. But the other reasons that Australia is also a very strong marketplace for business generally is because as Australia, we have a reputation of being early adopters. Right? If there's something new, we generally absorb it and want it pretty quickly. It doesn't matter whether it's tech, doesn't matter whether it's product, whether it's clothing, whatever it happens to be. Australia has a reputation of being very, very early adopters and taking it up, which is what quite often people, when they want to go into the Asian region, we've got the traditional Western marketplace, we've got the Asian marketplace. They can test both marketplaces actually in country and then take their product to the Asian theatre as well. But it is a very, very strong marketplace in terms of early adoption, which is very, very, very important. I've already spoken about the location, Asia Pacific, so I won't discuss that. One of the things you do have to consider when you're talking about the Australian dynamic, Australia is a really big place. For those of you who haven't been here, I know you've seen it on a map, but it is a very, very big place. So depending, if you're doing e-commerce, it's not relevant. But if you're actually shipping product or dealing with actual goods, then you have to give special consideration as to how you're going to transact operationally in the country, because distances in terms of logistics can be relevant as to how you go about planning what you're doing, whether it be warehousing, whether it be port of entry, all those type of things are very, very relevant. It's a whole discussion in itself, but I just wanted to make the point that we're located very well, but we are a very, very large country. And that's very, very important for you. We have a very established regulatory regime. You know, our legal system is a strong legal system, and one that you're broadly, you know, that your lawyers will be broadly, you know, we broadly say is aligned with ours, given our history, goes without saying. And we've also got a very, very strong financial sector. Okay. And also from the legal system point of view, when it comes to contractual relationships and so forth, they are all not unfamiliar to you, and you'll be able to deal with them rather easily. And you'll see in one of the slides a bit later on, we'll talk about the ease of doing business here. But they're all very, very relevant exercises. Let's just have a quick look at some of the sectors that have been some pretty strong growth. These are by no means the only sectors, right? I'm just touching based on a few of them. I'm sort of 8 or 9 of them, because we don't want to get down too much in the weeds specifically today, but it just goes to show the diversity, which is what I'm trying to demonstrate, of the type of people that are looking to come to Australia and have come to Australia. You know, both our clients and more broadly than that. So healthcare is very, very strong. That's you know, for all the obvious reasons, ageing populations and so on and so forth. I don't think that is a singly Australian dynamic, but it is very, very real and very, very aggressively pursued here, both from a general healthcare perspective as well as tech. Health tech is very, very important. The retail trade, the high street shops have obviously gone through a bit of a torrid time. It's pretty hard to do well when you're doing when you're in lockdown. Having said that, though, our e-commerce platforms that we look after have done exceptionally well. If you look at the likes of Boohoo, which I'm sure you've all heard of, I actually am the local director for Boohoo, so we've got a fair degree of knowledge there. They've had, you know, bumper times, not only in Australia but obviously elsewhere. It's a public company, that's all on the public record. I'm not giving away any trade secrets there. You know, we act for a number of other e-commerce type platforms and that look after both the logistics side as well as the actual sales platform side from beginning to end, and they have all done remarkably well. For those clients that were either well set up for e-commerce or could adapt very quickly to an e-commerce environment, they have done and had very, very strong years. They've done very, very well in their profit reporting. The other area is some of the other areas of transport, which has also been very, very positive. And it's not only the transport itself, it's also the allied industry. We look after a number of businesses that are primary contractors with that sector. So that's pretty important. Education has always been a very, very strong area here, COVID aside for one moment, because we've got a very, very strong export market as far as that is concerned. Professional services, scientific services, technical services, exceptionally strong. You know, in the last 12 months, even during COVID, we've received or we've onboarded numerous clients in that particular space. And many of those clients, the majority of those clients, leaving aside some of the e-commerce ones, have actually put people on the ground here, which is a part of the dynamic depending on what your model is. And once again, we can have some chats about that. And depending on what space you're in, defence is very, very strong at the moment. Part of the geopolitical exercises, we're ramping up our defence area, and that really involves both the primary contractors and the secondary subcontractors, and we have acted for both coming into country. So if you are involved in that particular space, that is a particular area or sector that is growing strongly, very, very strongly. Okay, medical, as I've said a bit earlier on, it's part of healthcare. Entertainment is also very, very strong. So they're just some of the headline items. In the slide deck, there is some more information and some stats and some slides about the specific sectors and in percentage terms for those that are interested in the stats to see exactly where it is in a more detailed format. But I'm not going to bother those. I'm not going to go down that road today and start putting up those slides. So the reality of it is, you know, it's what I call that ripple effect. Nobody escapes the new dynamic. Nobody can. It's not possible. And it's a changing world. And if we don't change with it, and our clients don't change with it, they get left behind, and which is why we spend a lot of time with our clients exploring new markets, wherever that happens to be, which is precisely what you're doing today. The world is a much smaller world. It's a lot easier to go cross-border in one sense than it was 10 years ago, for all the obvious reasons. But nonetheless, it has its challenges, not insurmountable challenges, but it is something that needs to be clearly understood. And with the likes of HURST, ourselves and so forth, we'll be able to help you do that. So that ripple effect is something that you can't avoid as far as we're concerned. So let's just talk about that ripple effect. I know you'll probably all be aware of this, but I'll just state, even though it's part of the obvious, the disruption to globalization, as a consequence of Brexit, which you know about, obviously, and that's still ongoing. The China-US dynamic and the geopolitical exercise, which Australia is very much part of. The UK is part of that as well. One of your large warships is currently doing a tour of duty in our backyard, which, for all the obvious reasons, to demonstrate not only both the support but the willingness to be involved, which has got certain flow-on effects. There's the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which one of the reasons for your free trade agreement is that it was going to hopefully act as a smoother pathway, enable you to get a clearer and a smoother pathway into that Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is in itself indirectly going to, not from the Australian point of view, but indirectly going to elevate your trading capabilities in region. Okay, so that's a very, very strong aspect of it. And we've already talked about the APAC region military expansion type issues that are currently confronting us and the world more broadly, which is changing, through the geopolitics of it, the way we are doing business. 10 years ago, if you would have talked about the impact of China and supply chain logistics, people would not have cared. 2 years ago, just prior to COVID, when I was attending a presentation by the chief economist for the Hong Kong Chamber for HSBC in Australia on the world dynamic at that stage as far as COVID was concerned, which is not quite 2 years ago now, but still. The question I asked him was, will people start to move away from China from a supply point of view, from a manufacturing point of view, because of this? Did he think it would have an impact? And his answer at that stage was that probably not, because the dollar speaks very, very loudly, and people will have a short memory. Well, what we're now seeing some 1.5 to 2 years later is that within the Australian dynamic, and I don't think it's going to be that vastly different elsewhere from the reading that I've done, there is a growing sense of dissatisfaction. I'm not talking about how they handled COVID, not going to have that discussion, but about the reliance on China. That reliance is making people considerably nervous. So they are looking at those other alternative pathways. So once again, the ripple effect, whatever is happening in the world, we're not acting, yes, we're an island here in Australia, but we're not immune to what is going on around us. And neither are you, okay? Neither is anybody. So that's just also a very, very clear exercise. So the resilience of supply chains, so as not to have the problems we've had in the past, and the ability to diversify trade is a key indicator of what people are thinking today, and from what we've seen. Okay. The FTA, I don't want to speak tremendously about the FTA in detail because I can't. As we said, 700 pages worth of minutiae, and maybe Adrian, you've got sort of some points to add about it a little bit later on. But it's obviously designed, broadly speaking, to encourage trade between the two of us. It's going to elevate it, leaving aside some challenges still. But it does provide opportunities there's no doubt, just in the crossfire of labour and the mobility of labour. That alone is significant, COVID aside, in terms of opening up the borders. But that is a tremendous benefit that we will all be able to harness, whether it be my business, which is me taking some people from HURST and bringing them to my neck of the woods during when I need them, or vice versa, or various other businesses that have got shortages of supply of labour and for various reasons. That will all be, that is one huge benefit that will be there. So that, together with regional integration. So if somebody's got any questions about the FTA, I'm happy to try and field them at some stage. But in reality, it's probably a little bit too new, given the fact there was only a lot of the things were only announced yesterday about the sign-off, that for us to be able to give sort of, or for me anyway, to be able to give a very much a more detailed response. I've already spoken earlier on about the jobs that are very, very relevant to you in terms of the UK. Once you expand your marketplaces, you will have to, or you may need additional resources. You may have to put on more people to actually service that, which is a positive thing. But once again, I'm not going to go into the weeds on that one. Who is meant to be the primary beneficiaries regionally in the UK? They took, from the reading that I've done and from what I've been told by various folks, you know, from the various departments on both sides, in the UK, from the UK position, it's Scotland, northeast, northwest of England, which is broadly speaking where you guys are, West Midlands, and also southeast and London. So there's obviously a lot of businesses in those regions that are going to be able to harness the benefit of that. Specifically, you know, in terms of exporting to Australia, whether it be pharmaceuticals, medicinal areas, whether it be clothing, beverages, so forth. We all know about whiskey. Someone who's not in part, you know, who doesn't mind a glass every now and then. I'm looking forward to that aspect of it, as well as motor vehicles. So there are some, you know, some very strong positives as far as that's concerned. I'm now going to move away from the broader outline of the Australian dynamic, which we've been discussing for the last 25 minutes or so, and go back into a little bit into the weeds in terms of, once you decide you want to come out here, what do you have to do? What are the things that you have to be mindful of from a business DNA point of view? If I was actually had the ability to travel and I was asked the question, and I had been asked the question previously, what would be the best advice for somebody, or that I could give to somebody if they were contemplating doing business in country in Australia? And sorry guys, let me just turn this on again. What happens is that the best advice I could give people ordinarily would be to hop on a plane and come down here for a few weeks. You can't get an appreciation of what the market that you want to enter into without actually, or as good an appreciation, without actually pounding the beat, seeing the clients that you want to interact with, seeing the competition and how they're acting, and getting a very, very strong feel for the marketplace. Okay? That's what would ordinarily happen. Okay? Now, obviously today that can't happen, but it will happen at some stage. At some too distant future, and I would encourage people to adopt that particular strategy. It's not that far, it's not that hard, but it gives you a very different perspective. You know, so the Zoom call compared to walking down the street and seeing your clients and competition is just incomparable. It is just incomparable. So having said that, the things we'll talk about structures in a moment. Just from a regulatory overlay perspective, for the moment, we're a highly regulated environment, not vastly dissimilar to yourself, but we are very finicky on certain things. So our anti-money laundering legislation, just like yours, our counter-terrorism legislation, and our tax positioning is all very, very rigidly controlled and reviewed. Okay? So somebody, when they come to Australia, they need to be mindful of all these things. Not that anyone's doing anything wrong within our participants today, but there's oversight. No, in many respects similar to what you've got in the UK. So you just have to be mindful of that. It's not, you know, yes, we are throwing another shrimp on the barbie and we're pretty relaxed, but when it comes to some of these areas, the rules, the banks, the tax office, the corporate regulator, you know, our equivalent of Companies House and the tax office is have got very strong processes and protocols. We shepherd all our clients through those processes, but just be aware that there is a process that one has to go through. Proof of identity today is one of the foundations. Okay, and what has to happen with that and how they have to get appropriately certified, I'm not going to bother with now, but that's very, very relevant. One of the things you are going to require when you come to the country, if you're going to start doing business here, you may have staff here, you may not. If you do, you may have a trusted staff member, you may have someone who you don't necessarily know, they're just a fairly new hire. You do need an in-country director if you're going to be doing business in country. We will offer that service for people who we know and who are referred to us, because we've also got to be mindful of know who we're dealing with type exercises, and I won't say more than that. But you do have to have that from a regulatory perspective. It doesn't have to be a citizen. It has to be someone who simply got their feet on the ground in country at the moment. And if they leave, you just got to find somebody else. Okay, and that's enshrined in legislation. It's not an optional extra. That's fairly straightforward. Because you're a foreign corporation in one form or another, and we'll talk about what that means, there are some regulatory overlays apart from doing tax returns and some companies' house registrations that you would require here. It's fairly straightforward in that regard. It is not difficult to do. Likewise, you don't have to do, without knowing all your profiles and how large you are. As a general rule, many of you will not have to do audits locally from a compliance point of view. And that's a form filling exercise. You do it once and you don't have to do it again until such times you grow to a certain size. Okay. So once again, very, very easy to do, not difficult at all. Very different from when you go to a place like America, which has got multiple rules in different states. It's considerably more complicated. Australia, we have got one income tax. It's a federal income tax. It could range between 27% and 30%, but it's at a federal level, not at a state level. Once again, making it very easy. What I will say about taxation, though, is that doing cross-border work, depending on how you structure yourself, and we won't go into the depth of that today, but quite often many overseas corporations with what I call mission control, they set up another structure. It's possible they can use a branch operation, but many of them set up another structure. And the interrelationship of that structure becomes very, very important from a tax point of view, because both Her Majesty's from a tax collection perspective and our Australian Taxation Office, which is the equivalent, they both want a larger share of that pie. Surprisingly, they've got a few bills to pay nowadays, running up a few $1 trillion worth of debt tends to do that. So what happens is the cross-border connections and where that profit resides and how it's pushed and pulled needs to be really given proper consideration. It's not like it was 20, 30 years ago, or 20 years ago, when as a small operation, you probably weren't even on the radar. Small businesses really, if you turned over less than $250 million, you didn't even get a Guernsey. They just didn't want to know about you from a cross-border pricing and an international point of view. Today, that's no longer the case. Today, you're low-hanging fruit by comparison, because every tax office, whether it be the UK or the Australian one, has what they call the equivalent of an international dealing schedule. That's what we call it in Australia, an IDS, international dealing schedule. It's part of the tax filings. And you have to start disclosing what all those interactions are and how you've arrived at the figures that you've arrived at. And therefore, you've got to give that proper consideration. Otherwise, if it's not given proper consideration and the right box isn't ticked, then what will happen is that the radar goes off or the bleep goes off, and at some stage you can expect an inquiry. That's nothing to be scared of. I'm not suggesting that that's a concern. All I'm suggesting is give consideration. You'll see the guys at HURST to make sure your cross-border pricing policies and how you're interacting is all done in accordance to make sure that you're not being compromised on the UK side of life. At some stage, they'd reach out to us and say, this is what we're doing here. How's that going to fit with the Australian side of life? But it's very much a point of consideration, definitely not a problem, just a point of consideration. And we have, in part of our structuring arrangements from time to time, had a look at arrangements, and we've told people that it would be better from our perspective, as well as another jurisdiction's perspective, if we could slightly massage that the way the business is being done to great effect to make sure that there was no tax loss unnecessarily with whatever manifestation that comes, income tax, GST, whatever the case might be. So once again, when it comes to corporate structures in Australia, it's fairly straightforward. We have companies, which you all understand the concept of a company, whether it be a branch or a subsidiary, still a corporation. We have trusts, and we have partnerships and joint ventures. Okay, we've got various hybrid type structures, but broadly speaking, in terms of the overseas dynamic, most people tend to work with corporations rather than trusts, because there's certain downline problems with trusts by the time you bring money back to home jurisdiction, to mission control. So the question there for when it comes to the company, is it done as a subsidiary or is it done as a branch operation? And quite often the question that gets asked of us, of any accounting and tax advisor type people, it's always asked from the perspective of taxation initially. That's quite often, not always, but quite often that's the sentiment that comes through. And the answer that I give to people is, can you just park the tax issue for a moment and let's have a look at your business model, what you want to achieve, what you need to achieve from a practical business perspective. Then we'll overlay the most appropriate tax mechanisms. And if that for some reason has got a bit of a mismatch under certain circumstances, we'll see if we can actually move some of those flags in relation to how you're currently transacting business to get the best, most efficient outcome. But purely to look at taxation, it's like building the perfect mousetrap, but unfortunately there's no mouse left in the building. You've actually got to look at what you're trying to achieve, what you need to achieve, and then overlay the appropriate mechanism as far as that's concerned. So tax is important, but it's not the first question. Look at the business model, and then we take it further from there. When it comes to companies and repatriating profits back to mission control, it's not a problem. Once you pay a dividend, once a company here pays its tax at the relevant rate, the dividend can be paid out. $100 earned, let's say it's 30% of the tax, $70 can be paid out as a dividend. There's no further taxes, no withholding taxes or anything of that nature. The question is whether you can get your money out prior to dividend loan. So you might have a royalties type stream, you might have an intellectual property type arrangement where you can actually charge for that intellectual property, which may have a withholding tax, but it's at a much lower rate than that 30%. Therefore, you've shifted, not inappropriately, but you've shifted the profits back to mission control in a more efficient and effective manner. And that's all part of that dynamic and discussion that HURST's tax team would discuss with you before they even sort of reached out to us, once you got down to that level of detail and minutiae. But quite often you can actually appropriately redirect profits back to mission control without causing any grief, without causing any problems, without being aggressive and all those type of things. But it actually leads to significantly better and more efficient outcomes. And the area there, as I said, is transfer pricing considerations. There is another consideration which is very relevant that quite often people get wrong. So I just want to mention that, and that is in relation to employing staff in country. Australia is an expensive country when it comes to wage costs, labour costs, by comparison to other jurisdictions. And what we have seen in the past also is that we've seen where various clients have wanted to take their employment arrangements that they've currently got with their existing staff in their host jurisdiction, want to use that contract and say, well, I'm going to do that with all my Australian employees as well. It works well for us, everyone understands it, and we're just going to do that. The answer is probably not. Right? Our industrial relations law, our HR laws are such that you've got to be mindful of certain specifics. The essence of it, yes, but the detail you've got to be careful of. As an example, we have 4 weeks annual leave every year. We have superannuation pension plan type arrangements that you must be mindful of. We have long service leave arrangements you can't opt out of. The annual leave, we saw, a client the other day whose home jurisdiction said that if our staff don't use the annual leave, they lose it. Well, the use it or lose it is not a philosophy, is not something that you can do in Australia. Equally, this morning someone reached out to us and said, what we're going to do is we're going to abide by all the federal holidays, but all the state-based holidays, we don't want to apply those to our staff. Well, it's not a choice. You don't have a choice of applying them. So when it comes to it, you're going to need to get a local lawyer who's familiar with those laws and those regulations to make sure that the contract is fit for purpose. You can take the contract as you see it, as you've got, and they can harmonise it, or you can speak to them and they can build it from the ground up. It's pretty efficient. If you need contacts in that regard with the legal fraternity. We do that on a very regular basis. So we'd be happy to make those introductions for you. I think I've probably given you a lot of information at this stage. And I know that it's with Zoom, it's a little bit more challenging, and I hope I haven't put too many people asleep while they've been watching me. So it's now 15:15. It's been going for 45 minutes. I just thought if there was any questions for me, or alternatively, we can leave it till the end. And Adrian, if you'd like to hop in.
No worries, just in time. Just to mention, Robert referred to a slide deck a number of times in his presentation. We are going to be circulating that out with the recording, so you'll have that slide deck there. Okay, so Adrian, over to you.
Thank you very much, Robert. So just a few reflections from a UK perspective on all of this. I think in my experience, I think, as you said, Robert, I think what we find, I've certainly found that working in Australia is somewhat different to what we're used to in the UK, particularly, again, from my area of expertise from a tax perspective. Things are different. You know, the withholding tax rules are different, the investment rules are slightly different, but it's something we should embrace, because I don't think it's that different. I think we're probably, in the UK, the people on the call, we're used to investing into the EU, but we've gone through a period of change with that as well. So this is something, I think that the differences we see with Australia are certainly something we should embrace, I think. I think the interesting thing about the stats that you mentioned there, Robert, for me were very, very interesting. I think when you talk about the 13 to 14,000 SMEs investing currently in Australia, to me that says, well, it might be different, but it's absolutely a well-trodden path. It's absolutely something we can do. And again, in my experience, it's certainly been a thing we can do. And again, Robert, when you mentioned potential finickiness on the part of the Australian Tax Office, again, I've absolutely seen that. But I think the simple answer there is, as you say, is you get over there, you spend time there with the people, but also you just build a little bit of time into your process. So you add a little bit of time up front to make sure that if you have to go through review boards and you have to speak to the Australian Tax Office about things like GST or VAT, you build an extra month or so into that process to do so. So it's absolutely not insurmountable. And I think the evidence there is clear in terms of the number of businesses that we see from the UK working in Australia. I suppose that was it from me, really, just from a UK perspective. Actually, as you said, Robert, I would be very happy to field any questions that the people on the call want to pass through to you. About, we could do a double header there. You and I could talk through the issues that you've seen. My experience from a practical what I've seen people outbound investing into Australia, and you with the technical expertise there. So if people do want to take us up on the offer, please just email me or call me directly for those of you who know me, or you can send an email to inspired@hurst.co.uk and we can take it from there. So
can I just add one more thing, Adrian, to what you said? And it was remiss of me not to mention it in my presentation. One of the things that we get asked on a regular basis when it comes to people wanting to come in country or do business with Australia is about GST out there, VAT, what we call GST, because you don't actually have to be in country to be subject to the GST rules. And I'm not the GST guru, but I probably know enough to be a little bit dangerous. For those of you who are doing business with Australia, it's not only about goods, it's also about services. It's also about, you could be doing electronic downloads, okay? Depending on how you're doing business with Australia, who your customer base is. So for argument's sake, one of my clients has an online service that they sell to end customers, to consumers. Okay? They're more than $75,000 a year. They have got, broadly speaking, a GST consideration. Okay. Broadly speaking, if it's a business-to-business arrangement online, as an example, well, then the probability is that it will not necessarily apply because it's effectively a revenue neutral exercise. It used to be that they made people register, they made people claim back. overall, they sort of came to their senses and said, well, if it's business to business, it's not such a problem. But it does depend on what you're actually doing on the ground here, and how you're doing it, and whether how you're transacting. And that doesn't mean making the sale. It's very different from a traditional income tax point of view. So GST has got a degree of complexity to it that you need to be mindful of. Okay, if you're importing product or exporting product from your neck of the woods, depending on who the importer of record is, will determine, largely the GST, or the goods and services tax liability implication. And broadly speaking, it applies to all goods and services, leaving aside certain types of food and certain types of medical exercises. But broadly speaking, if you are dealing in country, even if you don't have people here, you must be mindful of your GST obligation, and there may very well be a requirement for you to register. Okay, probably no different from other jurisdictions that you may be already dealing with, whether it be GST, VAT, whether it be Canada, or wherever it happens to be. So I just didn't want to mention that, because that is probably one of the most challenging issues for people in the first instance, because that can often change the way the business is actually transactionally structured. Okay, who's contracting with whom, and so on and so forth. And quite often, if we see movement in the intended arrangements compared to what it ultimately looks like, that's probably one of the key drivers, not the only one, but one of the key drivers, because it can be quite challenging. Because the last thing you want to have happen to you is to have to incur GST and not be able to claim it back. If it's revenue neutral, you don't care. The administration is a bit of a nuisance, but there are situations where we've picked up and we've advised clients where the way they've been structured and set up, they've incurred the GST without the ability to claim it back. Well, that's profit straight off the bottom line. Straight off the bottom line. So that's, Adrian, when you mentioned that, I'm glad you did, because that was definitely something that is very, very relevant. And while the business DNA up to a point is different in many respects, it is very similar. But one of the things that we definitely do have in common, right, more than anything else, is kippers. Now, you think that kippers are what you had for breakfast this morning, right? That's not the kippers I'm talking about. The kippers I'm talking about are the kids in parents' pockets eroding retirement savings. I think that is a universal problem that we all have. So the next generation is always poses certain challenges. So we definitely share that with you, and with probably many other jurisdictions as well. But questions, if anybody has any, or emails, as suggested by Adrian.
What I'll do is I'll just pause the recording in a minute, and then if anybody does want to ask a question, that they can do so. Just to say, we had a conversation early on before we started the call. We can make this a lot more relevant to you and your individual circumstances. So do get in touch if you'd want a one-on-one with both Adrian and Robert, and we'll make that happen as sort of part of the deal of your attendance this morning. We're happy to do that. So what I'll do is I'll stop the recording now, and then if anybody does